Hi, so I'm going to just share my screen. Oops. All right, so I'd like to talk, firstly, I'd like to thank our sponsors, NetHealth, and we appreciate your support for the product camp. And today, as you know, I'm going to be talking about the tech design for the next billion. So now I'm a digital anthropologist, and what that really means is that I have been looking at digital media behaviors amongst low-income populations for about a decade, and particularly in contexts like India, Brazil, South Africa, Namibia, and elsewhere. And this sort of decade of experience has accumulated into my new book called The Next Billion Users by Harvard Press that got released last year. So, what is interesting is that in the same time, right, there's been a lot of interest in the next billion users. At the same time that my book got released, we had Google set up their next billion user lab, Spotify set up a similar kind of lab called the next billion. And in fact, a string of tech companies have done the same, right? So what is interesting is that they are seriously looking at the future of digital products being and resting on these next billion users. And it's not a surprise. If you think about it, just India and China alone in terms of user base makes the next web. And that we're barely scratching the surface. We're talking about 19% to 30% of outreach currently. So you can see that this has enormous amounts of scope, right? And we are looking at a game changer in the way in which these users are being looked at, because look, we are in a data economy, and there's a race in terms of the race to the to the future of the digital economy, being the ones who master AI, which means it's all about data, right? So you see in the last few years some really radical changes like Geo, which is a Reliance initiative in India, which managed to make data extraordinarily cheap. We're talking about, say, 15 cents per GB versus, say, in Europe, it's about €7, and in the US, about $14 to $15, right? And obviously, these prices are changing. But what this means is that next billion users are fast coming online, and they're using digital media in ways that are going to shift the way in which the web is designed and calibrated. But let's step back and even ask, who are these next billion users? Well, to start with, they are substantively young. On average, about 35% of them are young users, and it can go as high as 60% in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where significant number of the youth populations lay, right? Which means this is, again, the future of the internet. And as you can see, 85% of this population lies outside the West. And they tend to live in settlements such as this, which is basically these informal settlements we're talking about, where one family lives in a one-room home, right? You have grandparents, you have children, so you don't have much privacy, and then you are watched by a community. So it puts privacy in a whole different perspective in terms of sharing of spaces, including online spaces, with sharing of mobiles. Now, mind you, 1 billion of these next billion users live in settlements such as this. And it's expected that it's going to go up to 2 billion by 2030. And this is the stats coming from pre-pandemic times. So there's a good chance we're going to see it actually higher than this envisioned statistic, right? Now, there's a sort of an insidiousness in terms of the recent gender capture, in terms of there is a growing gender divide. And a recent report on women and the web as of last year stated that there's actually a decline in gender uptake of mobile technologies, which makes no sense, right, on the surface, because if it becomes cheaper and it's broadened, and we are supposed to be progressing in a positive way, Why is that so? Because to some degree, social cultural norms are extraordinarily sticky, right? And in fact, if anything, a majority of women live in patriarchal societies. And these digital media spaces are very powerful public spaces, actually. So we are looking at entire social lives being lived online, which is really what digital anthropology is looking at how these flourishing lives take place online, shaped by the uniqueness in certain ways of certain interventions, certain features, certain sort of settings that sort of calibrate your movements and your behaviors. So there's also partly about the gender pay gap, right? So women tend to earn less, so they can't afford to actually buy their own phones. And there's a cultural dimension that men tend to have their own phones and tend to use and have much more leisure, so they tend to actually use it much more than women who are meant to use it for more practical purposes. And now we see that, there's a lot of concern because of revenge porn and, a lot of harassment, particularly gendered, which is making men like fathers, husbands, brothers be very, very protective of the women in the family and thereby preventing them from using these digital media. And this has obviously consequences on, the sort of inclusiveness of design, right? So I'd like to touch on 5 points that I really would like to push forward when we're talking about next billion design, right? So how do you design products for these next billion users, not in terms of an altruistic way, because this is a legitimate market. It's an economy of scale. And not just that, it is a data economy, right? So we need to sort of rethink in terms of the kinds of apps we design and why, because it is all about a lot of preconceptions deeply rooted in sort of our stereotypes of what these populations tend to do and who they are. Well, for starters, is the first being fun. Now, when we think about designing for the next billion users, we think about low-income segments, so thereby, surely, because of their scarce resources, they will be much more pragmatic with their usage. Women will check health care information, farmers will check crop price information, children will learn on the internet, and they will optimize their limited resources. But on the contrary, we have to look at it based on what the data is telling us. And what the data is telling us is disproportionate direction of the data usage is going towards leisure-oriented content consumption, which is Tollywood, Hollywood, right? Gaming, pornography, social media, interaction, right? So you cumulatively put it together, and it's not a coincidence that Jio, the company in India that tried to market its new data plans, actually had an ABCD principle attached to it, which means that this is how you get user uptake, is the 4-point: astronomy, right? B for Bollywood, C for cricket, and D for devotion, because they just looked at what the data was telling them, and that's where the data was going. Here you see Sumit Jain, who became a major TikTok influencer, garnering about millions of followers in a very short time. And he comes from a very rural town, small town in the outskirts of Mumbai. And what was his expertise or his influential sort of capabilities? He was able to do these flips and dance moves that really made people feel that it was cool, and it uplifted them. So look, it's not trivial, and this usually creates this major moral panic, but we need to really look at it in another way. This is really about an essential coping mechanism because they often can't control their precarious situations. So we need to flip this pyramid, right? As a typical Maslowian sort of pyramid of needs, which has dictated our understandings of low-income populations for decades. And in spite of all the evidence against it, it seems to be the most compelling framework. We keep squeezing these populations in, right? And what we need to turn it around, because self-actualization is the key driver pushing next billion users to these apps for their pleasure, for discovering who they are, to rehumanize themselves, particularly in extraordinarily dehumanizing jobs and situations. A second is about flexibility, right? Because we have to understand that because these are daily laborers, they tend to be not used to, a stable job. So they're used to a sort of a precarity on an everyday level, which means that they tend to be very ingenious in making sure they get what their needs are, fulfilling their needs, right? And you see, a case in point, and this became a major phenomenon. We're talking about the Jugaad innovation or frugal innovation in the 1990s, which was really celebrating the bottom of the pyramid, but it was perhaps too early in those times because at that time it wasn't about the data economy, right? And products realized that they can't actually keep sustaining it, and for a variety of reasons, it fell through. And now it's regained momentum, understanding that it's all about the flexibilization of products, which can broaden then the kind of users you can actually attract and sustain on your platform. Like more specifically, take music platforms, for example, right? Now, as Spotify enters markets like India and many parts of Africa, it's not sufficient to just translate your app and make it indigenous in nature and thereby, feeling that that's a way to localize your application. For instance, you need to optimize it and create far more value addedness because with high rates of piracy, right? We're talking about up to still 60 to 80%. Music as a product is not sufficient to get people on your platform. You need to see it as a social platform. You need to give them a value for networks. You need to actually compound it with other features like mobile payments and educational videos and other values that they can thereby actually come to your platform and stay within it, right? It needs to be thought through in that way. For example, even a simple thing like a family plan, what does that mean in a postpaid sort of scenario that typically Spotify would actually focus on? Is that it doesn't apply to the millions of Bangladeshi workers moving to Dubai, particularly we're talking about 8 to 12 men in a room, right? That's their family. Or millions of Filipino nurses leaving their families behind and moving to Canada, and again, sharing rooms and keeping in touch with their families. Now, their family is the group of girls and women staying in that room. So we have to really rethink what constitutes as a family as well as internal migration, right? In many of these countries, as we see from the pandemic, with mass internal migrations going between the urban and the rural. Now, the third aspect is fusion. Now, we keep talking about, let's break up the tech, and for good reason, because it is, constraining genuine competition. However, what we see is in the global south, these tech oligarchies or conglomerations coming up it's like Facebook, Twitter, and Amazon rolled into one plus 1,000 other apps. It is a very different kind of scale. And the reason being, these kind of massive conglomerations are taking place in places like China and India. Having the state and the private sector working very closely is because of resource optimization. We're talking about countries which are still relatively very poor and need to optimize their resources in a way which can govern people as well as serve them, because these are welfare nations primarily, right? So we have to think in those terms that what you're doing is you're actually designing for applications within a broad ecosystem that may not change for the near future and may even consolidate even more so, right? Now, fourth part is about friction, right? So we talk about design as an art of effortlessness, this idea of that the less intervention, the less friction, the better. But on the contrary, you need to infuse a certain amount of ethical, strategic friction so as to protect users from themselves and from third-party dangerous scammers and others who are going to abuse that kind of trust. Because once you lose the trust of these users, you may take a very long time to regain that. Take, for example, even romance economy, right? Which is a very flourishing economy, because think about it. About less than 2% of these young populations in the global south will ever have a regular romance marriage. They will have an arranged marriage. A lot of them will never talk to the opposite sex until after marriage, right? So we're talking about some entire generation being fed on these Bollywood romances and yet are unable to meet these needs, and desperate teenage experiences of of a dating or romancing. And so you see a lot of like romance scammers. In fact, the internet romance scam operations go into multi-million euros, and entire even applications are being created just to scam people for a little bit of money through recharging, right? So bots, along with like a team of internet romance scammers, are busy trying to squeeze a little money out of people who are desperately in search of love. So particularly with mobile payments, we need to ensure that we need to create enough to slow down and protect them, including those certain kind of redressal systems, and strengthening our QR codes, and a lot of trust-based mechanisms, which will add a little friction, but will gain you a very loyal and trustful user group, right? And last but not least is they seek for fabulousness. And what I mean is that they don't want a watered down version of what we have. They want fabulousness. They want the bling bling. In fact, if you look at the history of low income populations consuming products, they have often gone for extravagant, conspicuous consumption models, right? And we have evidence for that, and yet we refuse to acknowledge that. And it may seem so ridiculously irrational, but on the other hand, it's a very strong status signal. It's this aspirational model. It's a way to gain dignity in your community, even if you are crippled with debt. Look at the Shenzhen Gold phone, right? When Shenzhen just kicked off in about a decade or so ago, it's like what it was doing was it was trying to attract low-income Chinese users, and it realized very quickly that they didn't want practical phones only. They wanted something that looked cool, so they introduced the Gold phone, which sold like hotcakes, and they charged a little more, but the people were willing to pay for that. And 10 years later, Apple released their Gold phone, right? So my basic point here is we need to really, when we talk about empathy in the loop, which is sort of, this human in the loop, human-centered design, what do we mean is that we need to understand that if you and I were in their position, we would probably behave in ways that they do, right? Because we have a sort of universal sort of desire for love, for entertainment, for pleasure, and the sort of self-actualization, except our constraints are very different. They come under extremely different constraints and situations. And that's what empathy is, that they are not intrinsically different from us. They're different because of their situations and their context. We need to normalize difference. We need to look at diversity not as a burden or something that you have to add on, but as default, because what we are going to do then is you're going to create deeply flexible products, because we cannot possibly imagine what users will use technologies for. And that actually humbles technology designers, right? So by humbling yourself and understanding that this is a co-production process, you will possibly build much stronger products which will be used by a diverse group of users, and thereby scale it in a way which can be very powerful. And last is we need to frictionalize action, because that way you can really optimize for trust by intervening in very small but measured ways. And I think that's where design can really make a difference. Thank you, and I look forward to chatting with you.
Guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to write in the Q&A section.
Oh, thank you. So, any questions? Yeah, so Christina asks, can you give some examples of optimizing for trust? For example, right now the onus, like mobile banking, has become a massive entity. In fact, if you look in the last month alone, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into investing in mobile payment applications, particularly integrating it with other sort of services in many of these countries. But what is interesting is this comes with a lot of risk because 1.7 billion of this population have never banked before. So what you're actually doing as a designer is you're introducing them to the culture of banking. And the responsibility is on the user, because with QR codes getting hacked, if the bank is able to see that a user agreed to a particular QR code thinking it is legitimate, they are responsible for their payment. So basically, it's a very high risk for a new banking individual, right? And so there needs to, and this has to be, in concert with governance also. But the problem is that we don't take into consideration educational videos, for example. So we need to also understand, we need to enculturate them into this banking practice. So it could be simple little pop-ups, right? To educate them about what to be watchful for, a sort of like a little feature of what are the common, like sort of crowdsourcing feature about what are the typical scams going on right now. These kind of ways, because we have to assume that this is a work in progress and we need to really sort of educate our users on the go. Otherwise, we will lose trust, right? How do you go about customer development for these users? I mean, so this is Rahil asking, customer development for the users. I mean, how do you talk to these users to understand their personas? Yeah, so for example, right now I have a work going on in rural Kerala, which is in the south of India, among women, trying to understand why are women withdrawing from the internet. And it is really essential. So initially we, just asked them for consent, and often it was impossible to get them away from their mother-in-laws or their families. And it was always in the watchfulness of the rest of the family. And they usually gave us very sort of pocketbook answers of what you expected, that they have nothing to hide. They're really happy. They feel secure when their family is constantly looking at what their interactions are. So it was very sort of canned answers. So what we did then was we shifted it into basically moving it very quickly into digital ethnography, saying that, okay, we use a fieldwork to just connect and build a relationship, and then gave them a phone for work purposes, and thereby allowing them legitimacy to use a phone without being watched by their family. And that's where we learned that they tend to get monitored every single time. They get to only use a phone only in the evening. They had all these other parameters. And most importantly, women, disturbingly over 35, looked at themselves as too old for the internet, that they've perceived that the entire internet is for young people. And this is really interesting, because that means the demographic of 35 plus sees themselves as elderly because of like very young marriage. So they're probably grandmothers at that age, which was itself a learning lesson, right? So these are just some examples of how you sort of can, by shifting it and having a sort of a hybrid approach, you can really learn something. How do you know which of the five, so this is Alina. How do you know which of the 5 design codes to prioritize on, especially when working with tight budgets, timelines, or stakeholders who may not understand the value of all 5? Well, it's all about context, like what context you are, getting into. But look, the 5 parameters is just a way in which to emphasize that these are complex users and these are their everyday realities. So it doesn't have to be one versus the other. I'll give you a case in point is, for example, self-care apps in the health. So I was approached by a healthcare practitioner, right? An organization wants to design and spread their new app in African countries, except they designed their app as a very preachy app for young people, telling them about family planning. And they were worried why it's not going well. Well, just because you build the best kind of prehistoric app doesn't mean users will come. Because if you don't look at the science, which is basically that self-care apps are the #1 apps in the West. And why? Because teenagers are desperate to discover their body. They're constantly worried, are they abnormal, their pubic hair, menstrual cycles. And remember, this all these conversations don't get to be talked about in a lot of these conservative cultures. So if anything, self-care will be, in fact, even number one in these contexts, particularly conservative contexts. So the organization should have first actually watched for looking at them as teenagers who, in very conservative settings with very constrained budgets, need to still have those conversations because these are realities which are very human, right? And it was just not treated that way. It was very prehistoric development circle kind of, thinking. All right. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to rush through it. What are some tools to help this Dwayne? What are some tools to help design for the next billion? So, I mean, again, it depends on the context. I've given examples for, like banking, which is really very, very essential in terms of education, in terms of scamming, in terms of healthcare, another very important area, right? Tools in terms of also something as simple as mobile profiles, right? For example, I can't, in the West, right, I can't take my Facebook profile and just move it to Twitter. And so I have invested in building up, say, friends, networks. I built my reputation on one platform, and I can't create a kind of mobility. And these kind of tools are really important because we need to rethink the way in which profiles can be navigated and mobile. And so when people say give power to the consumer, I mean, we need to give that power because in China, they're able to do that because it's within a larger ecosystem, which is very, very attractive to a user, right? You're not married to one company. So we need to learn. It's not throw the baby with the bathwater. It's like everything now China is like horrible, and we can learn from them. And just like we can learn from many other apps out there, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? All right. So I think, am I missing? I think I am. Did I cover? I'm not sure if I've covered everything. Um,
Well, there's one question from Ashok.
yes.
He, how do you price points impact access when it comes to creating tech for social good?
So, what does that mean actually? Could you clarify that, Ashok? Like, what do you mean by that? And also, by the way, just in terms of the tech for good, right? I'm a little sort of cautious about that term itself because look, it's driven by again Silicon Valley. About we are talking about 85% of tech for good initiatives, and it's very dangerous when you're aiming for doing good. Actually, aim for you have to unpack what this goodness is because when we put ourselves on this sort of pedestal, right, of we're spreading goodness of democracy, these sort of diffusive sort of large scale principles, it tends to get lost in a sort of a top down sort of here we have figured it all out and we're going to give it to you. So it has to be about if you look at what's happened in terms of there's been stats across young populations about what they're looking for in terms of democracy. 2/3 of young people are really looking at good governance, as simple as that. They want something good governance. Are these things working? Are they working for me? It's not about goodness in a broad ways, but very tangible, very outlined ways, and it is something which is very essential, right? So but yeah, I'm sure that that was not your question, but all right, let's see. I'm trying to see where the questions are. All right, Ben. Oh, sorry. Yeah, you want
Yeah,
to?
there's one more question from Greg. Greg is asking, where can we get your book?
Okay. Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's you can pretty much the good old Amazon has it all, don't they? Actually, don't they have everything? I mean, so it's almost redundant. But yeah, you can definitely buy it on Amazon. Of course, you can also go to Harvard Press. It's on their website. So I'm sure the organizers could also share that on Twitter or wherever, right? So last is Ben. Ben, by the way, how many minutes do we have? We have 2 minutes. Is that right? Um, am I
Uh, no, we have time. Yeah,
sorry?
we have it till 11, so we have.
Okay. Okay. Good. All right. So Ben says, what do you think are the best digital methods that organizations in developed countries can use to better learn about empathize and understand these types of users, especially now that it is so much harder to physically travel and connect on a human level. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot out there. So the question, Ben, is that a lot of groups are out, very visible actually, a lot of civic groups who are very actively trying to do these ground level work, trying to showcase their demands, for example. Also, so I think it really helps in looking at the patterns of what kind of themes emerge. So one could be about data mining, right, and digital scraping in terms of having it much more open and not already creating prescribed categories, and seeing what is it that mainly concerns them, right? So for example, if you're looking at like app usage, and then you realize many of the people are actually talking about dating, even though it's not a dating app, then there's something strange. Or a health app, as I mentioned about the self-care, and they are really looking about body hair or masturbation or things that they could never bring up in their society. And so these are open categories, and then you start to sort of streamline it, right? But also there's a lot of active discussions, like I said, and we need to be much more watchful and then have interviews. What I realized was that this is a generation, particularly global South populations and these users, are extremely comfortable with digital platforms. In fact, if anything, they are even more comfortable, and you're going to get more authenticity online with them than if you meet them in a physical setting, because they are being watched by their families, their friends, and they have to sort of fit into the cultural stereotype, right? And I had a recent experience where I had a book talk on Instagram, which I had never actually had, by a very strong Indian influencer. She was a young girl actually who had more than 1 million followers, and she did a book talk of the next billion users, and it was all really like, she was extremely comfortable, no makeup, just like switching it on, the screen split, and there was a lot of action while we were talking, and this tiny little mobile I'm holding, and it was a real conversation, and there was comments and there was engagement, and I was realizing this is much more active and high quality in the kind of conversation I was having than if I had it in my typical Zoom classroom. So one is to get away from this idea that the digital is a watered down version, or it's a compromised way in which we can gather insight, but actually flipping it is that it is a small little safe space where you're going to see genuine authenticity of responses by a vast population that can't really express themselves in physical settings, right? Um, Abhay says, how would you optimize and prioritize, for example, trust over fabulousness? Well, actually, so here's in terms of priority, the next billion users tend to make their priority. For example, if, they make these choices, we don't, right? And we have to respect that these choices are coming from a point which is either a deep seated need to have dignity in your community, higher status, whatever it is. And so fabulousness tends to sometimes even overtake trust when it comes to signaling that you've arrived in your community. But trust is something which is underlying, because all of these interactions, right, are moving to the next level. So every platform now is striving to, well, become sustainable, which means that it is introducing e-payments, and we need to really inscribe that across board. It shouldn't even be either or. It should be the very basics upon which we build our applications, right? And of course, we're not doing this alone. We shouldn't be doing it alone, but we should recognize that it is a very essential fabric. It's a starting point, not something that we do as an add-on, right? And there is a gender dimension about trust. For example, my actually dilemma, by the way, so as you guys know, right, is that Facebook and Twitter have introduced this locked profile feature, because this was a response targeted particularly towards women in patriarchal conservative cultures in the global South, India, Middle East, etc. So they hoped that women would stay in Facebook, stay on Twitter, by locking themselves in, so the locked profile. But here's a weird thing, is part of what draws the internet and part of what teenagers seek for psychologically is visibility, right? So when you are in a locked domain, it's akin to domesticating women and saying, okay, I get it. This public space is unsafe. So I have a great idea. Why don't you go back home and stay behind your walls and stay with your safe space? And which means that you have given up on public space. So it actually may, and I'm deeply concerned that it'll actually do a disservice towards actually women actually using these technologies, because we really all need to be invested in making these into safer spaces and building trust in terms of like, will I be responsive as a platform in immediately within 24 hours removing harassment content, removing pornographic content without consent, that is, sexual images without consent, within 24 hours? Will I be militant about it so I can build trust for half the world's population, which is what we're talking about, right? All right. So am I missing something? Let me see. Yeah, I think that's, I guess that's any other questions, or did I miss something here?
Christina says here, thanks, Payal. Great talk. Good
Thank you.
means good means different things to different people or cultures. Would you want to talk on that more?
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. The history of being good is actually kind of deeply disturbing, right? Like if you think about it historically, be a good woman, right? Be a good wife. It actually has very negative connotations, meaning stay in your, space that we've boxed for you, right? Be a good citizen. What does that mean? That means don't create disharmony in society, which is, by the way, in many societies right now. So your content will be removed if you're not a good citizen, if you're not complying with certain codes, which actually could be very unethical or deeply morally subjectionable, right? So goodness actually has a history of tending to impose rules on entire populations in the name of very sort of either patriotism or culture, like this is good for our culture, so be a good, be good Indian or be a good African and hold your culture, meaning let's preserve the past and let's not disrupt it, let's not bring Western values into our culture. And so we have to remove users from the state, and this is happening across the world. I mean, no, there is no state, I think, that can be separated, and we need to allow ourselves to see users for what they are, who are desperately trying to carve out their spaces in spite of all what's happening right now, right? So that's why I'm very apprehensive when someone is talking about AI for good, when they're pushing these goodness agendas, because I find it, when I see something which is very diffused as a value, then there's little clarity, and that means there's too deep a hubris in the way in which you're going to approach design, which means you're not going to co-create. You're not going to actually genuinely listen to the concerns, and you may actually delegate it to, this is extremely irrational, or they don't know what they're talking about. We know what's better for them. And I'm not saying that they're all right in every way, but you have to understand the rationale. So they may even be seeking for things which are not good for them, but we have to understand deeper into why. The why question doesn't get answered through data mining. It's only through digital ethnography, which is why I'm obviously a big proponent of that. Yeah. So Ranga asks, how do I market my product to the next billion users? Well, I mean, part of it is if you are, really, the secret to good marketing is where you don't actually need to market, right? Where the users find it so appealing that they themselves become your ambassadors. And that's where what you want to really arrive at, isn't it? And in digital products, what's wonderful is that actually that can actually happen, right? Like in old school products, you hope for influencers, you hope for word of mouth. And, so some of these things are rather like obvious as look deeply and clearly of who are the influencers, who is shifting ways of thinking, and what strategies are they using, right? So like I learned a lot from this, this young girl on Instagram who was moderating my book talk, and I realized it's just the little discursive strategies of, she got up and her hair was messed up and she said, yeah guys, I haven't had my morning cup of coffee, and it was very raw, right? And we already know that this sort of rawness, this authenticity, this less of a curation and more of a, I get you, I can be you, you can be me, and yet, together we can do something cooler, right? And so I think it really is about trying to understand the psyche behind it and really get them to be your ambassadors, and that's really the goal for good marketing, isn't it? I think I have answered stuff, right? Anything else?
Yes, I think we don't have any more questions here in the chat box.
Okay. All right. So I think that's it, and I really hope you guys, seek for reaching out to these audiences. In fact, just as a wrap-up note, is I've had a lot of UX, a user experience, designers reach out to me wondering that, well, isn't this now, especially during the pandemic, a really high risk strategy to reach out to these populations? And shouldn't we do this only when we are much more secure? And I actually think it's the reverse, is because the situation is such and it's become so competitive, and that it is even more needed, because remember, because of the pandemic, not only are they investing exponentially in digital technologies for the next billion users, because they have no access to public schools, for example. So a lot of education apps are springing up, a lot of devices for synchronous, asynchronous kind of ways in which you can do outreach. And we're talking about majority of the world's population, that it actually creates massive market opportunity, because you can literally cater to these needs which are deeply essential. And these parents or these populations will make sure they will do anything to make that happen, so their children don't get behind. And so I think this is in fact the cornerstone in which you can actually have a USP and an edge over the others who are risk averse, right? So, all right, I guess that's it. I appreciate it. Thank you, and I guess we will end the session, right?
Sure, I think in the interest of time, we'll be closing this session now.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you, Payal, for the great talk. I had a great time, and I'm sure everyone did.
Thank you, and yeah, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and happy to connect and keep in touch. And thank you for making the time, especially on a Saturday. I know we all need our weekends, so I really appreciate this. All right, take care. Bye.
All right, thank you. Bye, everyone.